crazy. That's what the story of Jackie Mitchell is. Born in 1913, Mitchell grew up next door to Baseball Hall of Famer Dazzy Vance, who taught her the ins and outs of the game. When she was 17, she began playing for a women's team in her hometown of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and attended baseball camp in Atlanta, where she caught the eye of Joe Engel, owner and manager of the Chattanooga Lookouts, a Double-A minor league squad. During the Great Depression, the Lookouts became known for using various publicity stunts to draw crowds in. So, Engel made Mitchell the second woman ever to sign with an organized professional baseball team in March of 1931, following Lizzie Arlington. Engel then capitalized on another opportunity by scheduling an exhibition game with the most famous team in the world, the New York Yankees. On April 2nd, the Yankees came to Chattanooga. After starter Clyde Barfoot gave up a pair of hits, manager Bert Niehoff made the decision to pull Barfoot and send the 17-year-old Mitchell to the mound in the first inning. The first batter she faced took a ball before swinging and missing at the next two pitches. The fourth pitch was a called third strike. The batter shot a death stare towards the umpire and began verbally abusing him before having to be escorted away by his teammates. As angry as the batter was, the crowd loved it as they roared Jackie's name. After all, a 17-year-old girl just struck out a grown man, a New York Yankee no less. Oh, I forgot to mention, the name of the batter she struck out was Babe Ruth. The second batter Mitchell faced swung at 3 straight pitches to give her another K. This one was known as the Iron Horse, aka Lou Gehrig. And so, Mitchell etched her place in baseball history and American folklore for being the teenage girl who struck out 2 of the greatest players in the history of the sport. Ruth remained bitter about the strikeout. He was quoted in the Chattanooga newspaper as saying,
"I don't know what's going to happen if they begin to let women in baseball. Of course, they will never make good. Why? Because they're too delicate. It would kill them to play ball every day."
In what was widely considered a decision made to appease Ruth's ego, Baseball Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis voided Mitchell's contract, declaring that women were not fit to play baseball, as the game was quote-unquote too strenuous. Mitchell continued to play, barnstorming with the House of David, a team known for sporting long hair and beards. She would occasionally fake a beard for publicity purposes. But over the years, Mitchell became exhausted with such stunts. She was viewed as a sideshow, even being asked once to pitch while riding a donkey. In 1937, she decided she'd had enough, announcing her retirement at the age of 23. For clarification, Mountain Landis's comments about women being unfit for baseball wasn't an official declaration. The ban on women in baseball was an informal one, but it was still considered a ban nonetheless, from 1931 all the way until June 21st, 1952, when baseball made history by making the ban official. Women were formally prohibited from playing baseball from 1952 until 1992, when the Chicago White Sox drafted Carrie Schuler. Funny enough, the official ban was actually 2 years after Little League Baseball adopted one. When Little League did it, it was known as Tubby's Rule, named after Catherine Tubby Johnston, as Johnston was allowed to play in the Little Leagues in 1950 because there was nothing in the rule book that said girls couldn't play, until there was. Little League's ban lasted until 1974, when the New Jersey Superior Court ruled in favor of 12-year-old Maria Pepe, declaring that Little League must allow girls to at least try out. There are entire books and films all on the history of women in sports. While the history goes back as far as 368 BC with the 2-horse chariot race victory at the Olympics by Euryalus of Sparta, the bulk of the progress has come in the past 2 centuries, and really, the past 2 or 3 decades. Even now, there are many battles being waged in the world of women's sports, be it from a financial standpoint or even an inclusion standpoint. Today, it's certain that things are better than they've ever been for female athletes. But like with so many other things, there's still work to be done. In some sports, it's about lack of opportunity. There are currently no full-time women drivers at the top flight of Formula One, and the W Series, intended to be a women's-only version of the sport, went defunct after 2 years. The U.S. women's soccer team just earned equal pay in February of 2022, in spite of the fact that from 2016 to 2018, the women's team generated $50.8 million of revenue to the men's $49.9 million, and that the women's team has won 4 World Cups, while the men's team hasn't advanced past the quarterfinals since the first World Cup in 1930. The National Women's Soccer League was only established in 2012, and in 2021, half the league's coaches were either fired or resigned following allegations of widespread sexual abuse. Even in the world of NIL, things are complicated. In March of 2024, Livy Dunn was listed as the 3rd highest earning athlete in terms of NIL endorsements, and LSU basketball star Angel Reese was 7th. However, only 4 other women made up the top 100. Like Dunn, Haley Cavender of TCU was widely viewed as a sex symbol due to her and her twin sister Hannah's Instagram account. Haley was 32nd overall in NIL rankings. While Reese was a national champion and top 10 draft pick, she's also posed for the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue and been featured in a Cardi B music video. UConn's Paige Buchers, who is viewed as a generational WNBA prospect, was 65 on the NIL list. Caitlin Clark, the NCAA's all-time leading scorer, who has helped lead women's college basketball to greater success than it's ever seen, was just 38th, one behind Malachi Nelson, a quarterback at Boise State who has yet to attempt to pass in college. LSU's Flau'jae Johnson, who was also a successful rapper, was 16th, joining Reese and Dunn as the only women making over $1 million. Outside of Dunn, all of them are basketball players, leaving softball, volleyball, and soccer out. In fairness, UT's Sam Hurley is the only non-football or basketball star on the men's list, but the men's side also has a number of high school athletes and college athletes who have yet to earn regular playing time. The 6 women, however, are made up of 4 of the greatest basketball players in college history and 2 internationally known social media influencers. When researching the various mental health aspects of athletics, I primarily focused on male athletes due to the long-running stigma against men talking about their feelings and sharing their emotions. But I started wondering about how it was different for women in the field of athletics. What kind of resources do they have, and what kind of different issues do they face? Then I started thinking about my own struggles with trolls and online harassment, and wondered what a woman in the same line of work deals with. So from there, I decided to reach out to female athletes and reporters and take a look at mental health as it applies to women. This is a podcast examining what happens at the intersection of mental health and athletics. It's about taking a look at the human side of those we often view as superhuman. It's an investigation into how it feels internally on a stage that's so external. Most importantly, it's a conversation about people under the brightest of lights and what happens to them when the lights go out. Episode 4, Validation and the Mad Dog. In the United States, the 2 most successful professional women's sports leagues are the WNBA and the NWSL. The NWSL did not exist until 2012, while the WNBA was founded in 1996. How many greats never got the chance to show what they could do at the professional level because these leagues didn't exist when they played? In 2020, HBO produced a sports documentary entitled Women of Troy about Cheryl Miller and the USC Trojans women's program of the 80s. Miller was a 3-time National Player of the Year, 2-time national champion, an Olympic gold medal winner, and was enshrined in 3 different Hall of Fames. Yet she never played a game of professional ball. In 2022, The Queen of Basketball won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Short. The film told the story of Lucia Harris, who won 3 national titles in the AIAW, scored the first basket in women's Olympic history, and is to this day the only woman to ever have been drafted into the NBA. She never played in the NBA and spent just 2 seasons in the Women's Professional Basketball League before it folded in 1980. She never suited up again. Today, collegiate women's basketball has earned tremendous recognition due to the star play and presence of athletes such as Caitlin Clark, Angel Reese, and Paige Buchers. Before that, there were other stars who helped make the WNBA more watched as well, including Breanna Stewart, Sue Bird, and Diana Taurasi. And in its early days, the WNBA was known for stars such as Lisa Leslie, Cheryl Swoops, and Cynthia Cooper-Dykes. But there was another player who was on the same level as them in college. A player who could have had their name right alongside theirs at the next level if the opportunity had been around sooner and had she not been suffering in silence. A genuine star who had the misfortune of being in her prime a few years too early and dealing with mental health issues before people were even talking about them.
Hi, my name is Val Whiting. I am a former WNBA player and a 2-time NCAA champion in basketball. Currently, I am a mental performance coach for athletes.
Val Whiting came to prominence at Stanford in the early 90s when she helped lead the Cardinal to national recognition. Before that, however, she was just a kid from Wilmington, Delaware.
I got started playing basketball in 7th grade by accident. I wanted to be a cheerleader because I was being bullied so heavily. I thought if I became a cheerleader, then the bullying would stop because I'd be cool and popular. And so I tried out for cheerleading and didn't make it, and then was devastated because that was like my last chance to end the bullying. And I was actually pretty tall. I probably was 6 feet tall. I know at least by 8th grade, I was about the height I am now. But my math teacher, Mr. Perlman, said, "Hey, why don't you come out for basketball?" And I was like, sure. And I have no idea why I even agreed to go out for basketball because I never played any sports. The only sport I was playing was double dutch and tag. That's really pretty much all I did in the neighborhood with my friends. So I said, yeah, I'll come out for basketball.
By the time she reached high school, Val developed into a dominant post presence. She led Ursuline Academy to 4 scholastic basketball titles in 4 years and was named to the All-State team multiple times. Her success at the prep level earned her the attention of Tara Vanderveer, the head coach at Stanford. Vanderveer offered Val a scholarship to play for the Cardinal in 1989, which she accepted. She was then faced with the task of majoring in pre-med at Stanford, one of the most academically rigorous schools in the country, while playing basketball for a team coming off an Elite 8 appearance in the NCAA tournament. Initially, however, she didn't feel any sort of extra pressure. She simply went with the flow, showed up, and did what her coaches told her to do. To the outside world, she was exactly the kind of athlete coaches and fans dream of.
My first year in college, we won a national championship, so I thought that's what people did. And I didn't really feel any additional pressure probably until my senior year when we were expected to repeat because we had won the year before and all our starters were back. So that was probably the only time that I really felt any kind of pressure outside of what I would put on myself to perform.
On the court, that showed. Stanford won its first national title in program history Val's first season, and she was named Pac-10 Freshman of the Year. The Cardinal reached the Final Four once again her sophomore year before winning another national championship her junior year with a final record of 30-3. The Cardinal finished in the Sweet 16 her senior year. Val flourished individually with each season as well, including being named Pac-10 Player of the Year as a junior and again as a senior. She finished her career with averages of 16.1 points, 1.6 blocks, 1.5 steals, and 8.8 assists per game, while shooting 51% from the field. Again, at the time, Val felt all of this was just how things were supposed to be. But looking back on it now, she realized there were some things she was dealing with that she didn't yet understand. Things that a lot of people didn't understand.
I didn't really notice anything that had to do with my mental health. But when I look back, hindsight 2020, I see a lot of the signs that I was struggling with, just being moody, and then the triggers of being tired or not getting enough sleep would set me off. And I've always was called by my coaches when I was at Stanford and my teammates as someone who was a moody individual. So looking back, I can see it, but in the midst of it, no, I didn't really think about the pressure. Just kind of just pushed through. Mental health wasn't anything back in the early 90s. People really spoke about it with regards to athletes, because we're supposed to be tough and warriors, and it's a game. So how stressful can it be? And that's a lot of the viewpoints that were prevalent then.
When Val graduated from Stanford with a BS in biological sciences in 1993, the WNBA didn't exist. Though she was accepted into the University of California, San Francisco's medical school, she deferred the acceptance to instead continue her basketball career outside of the United States. She was playing in Brazil in 1996 when she got a call about a league that was being formed back in the U.S. It was called the American Basketball League.
Like 9 of the 12 women on the national team had committed to come and play in the ABL, and that was like 96. And then I played in the ABL for 2 years.
Val played for the San Jose Lasers alongside her former college teammate Jennifer Ozzie. Though a new business venture, the ABL seemed to have promise. The Lasers were owned by Joe Lacombe, a venture capitalist and majority owner of the Golden State Warriors. Val quickly established herself as one of the stars of the league, being named an All-Star and leading the Lasers in rebounding. She was traded to the Seattle Reign after a year in San Jose and finished her second season with averages of 15.4 points and 7.2 rebounds per game. Things looked promising for her basketball career until the middle of the 1998 season.
And then the league only lasted, because they paid us too much. They paid us 6 figures, lasted like 2.5 years, because at that same time, the next summer, the WNBA came about. And then we started competing with the marketing of the WNBA and the TV contracts of the WNBA. And so like mid-season 98, the league folded.
The timing of the league's breakup couldn't have been much worse. It was the holiday season, and now every woman in the league was wondering what they were going to do for work. While that's sometimes the reality of life as a pro athlete, keep in mind that this was a league of 9 teams, each with a roster size of more than a dozen. Over 100 players, coaches, and other staff members were suddenly out of a job. What's more is this was 1998. We didn't get news at the rapid-fire rate we do now.
Like, I remember being home for Christmas and a reporter calling me and asking me to comment on the league folding, and I didn't even know. That's how I found out that the league had folded, from a reporter, and I had to call to, I forget who I called to confirm it. And so we were home for Christmas, and ladies have bought a whole bunch of Christmas presents and everything. People were taking back Christmas gifts.
For Val, though, there was hope. As she mentioned, the WNBA had come into existence and was looking to poach the best the ABL had to offer. Even then, only players such as Val and Dawn Staley were fortunate enough to find work again. The WNBA had to protect its own players already in the league. It was focused on building its brand to make a lasting product. At the same time, that left many other players in the ABL without work and now in debt.
In '99 is when I got drafted by the WNBA, and I think only 20 of us got drafted because there wasn't enough room, because the collective bargaining agreement that year that the WNBA signed put a limit on how many ABL players could come in. So a lot of ladies didn't get the opportunity to play because of the limit of players.
Val was selected in the second round of the WNBA draft by the Detroit Shock, where she was reunited with Ozzie and Seattle teammate Astu Nadaye. They paired with Sandy Brondello, Dominique Canty, and others to finish second in the Eastern Conference regular season standings before falling to the Charlotte Sting in the playoffs. It was a bright start in a new environment. However, behind the scenes, Val began feeling different. She told JustWomenSports.com in May of 2022 that she began feeling depressed during that season with Detroit. She was called to go into a game once by head coach Nancy Lieberman and declined, saying she didn't want to. She took a year off from playing in 2000, citing personal reasons. Privately, she believed she was dealing with depression. It was only later that she found out the truth. During her year off, she got married and had her first child. She returned to the WNBA in 2001, joining the Minnesota Lynx. She played 32 games the next 2 seasons before hanging up her sneakers in 2002 at the age of 30. She was still experiencing feelings of depression, trying a variety of medications that never seemed to fully click for her. All the while, things became more challenging off the court.
How I do things is that I let stress build up and I don't address stuff. I just kind of just keep pushing. And I think in 2009, I had a miscarriage, but I kind of brushed that under the rug. And then I owned a business with my ex-husband. He was my husband at the time. And the business was really stressful. And I don't know, just one day, everything just kind of collapsed. And I had thoughts of just not being on this planet anymore. And so I admitted myself to the hospital voluntarily. And so when you go into the psych hospital, they kind of treat you like you don't know yourself. They treat you like you can't advocate for yourself at times because there are different extremes of psychosis. And so when you go in, they take away any shoelaces and they examine you, make sure you're not hiding any drugs. And you get this long assessment, and then they tell you you're depressed. And so I was misdiagnosed again. I think I stayed in for a week. There's individual therapy, there's group therapy. And so I get out, they put me on medication, but that medication put me into mania.
Still not sure what she was actually dealing with, Val continued to try and work her way through life. But it wasn't long before she found herself institutionalized once again. This time, however, she finally found out why she felt the way she did.
My second hospitalization was involuntary. I had to be actually taken in because the medication that I was on kind of just put me in the other side of things. And then I finally got diagnosed with bipolar and actually borderline personality disorder. And so they put me on antidepressants, but also a mood stabilizer. So I finally was getting the right diagnosis. But when I got it, I kind of resisted it because I was really into my health, and taking medication was like against my whole being as a person and someone who was in a health and wellness field. In addition to that, I know it's kind of superficial, but I didn't want to take medicine because some of the medications made you gain weight, they mess with your sexual function. So it was just a lot going through my head, and I felt flawed with this diagnosis. And that's just 2 of them. I also had body dysmorphia disorder, which stemmed from me being a female athlete. I had eating disorder and a little bit of anxiety. So it was just a whole bunch of things thrown at me, and I kind of just resisted and felt less than. And so it took me probably 10 years to, first of all, recover from the hospitalizations and feel like I could be myself again, but also feel not ashamed to talk about it. So I didn't even tell anybody why I took a season off in the WNBA until like 2020.
That was when Val told her story in a TikTok video. People began reaching out to her and telling her how much she inspired them to talk about their own mental health struggles. Listening to those people helped Val make the decision to become a mental health coach, using her Instagram and TikTok following to reach others. Over 2 decades after her retirement, she's found a new calling in life that's allowed her a feeling of freedom she hadn't previously known.
It does feel freeing. When you first even talk about the depressive side of things, you always feel like weak-minded or not mentally tough. But I didn't feel that way anymore. I felt like my story and me expressing myself could help others. And I've gotten proof that it's helped others because I would get messages on social media from random female athletes and male athletes as well saying thank you for what you said, and that's helped me get the help that I needed. So it's very validating when you hear people say that your story has helped them, and it just motivates me to not stay silent.
I want to repeat what I said in the first episode. I'm not a mental health expert. I haven't studied psychology or medicine or anything of the sort. But I do know two different people in my personal life who were misdiagnosed as having depression and anxiety when in reality, they were bipolar. The medication they took for anxiety and depression actually ended up making them feel worse. Both of them are women. While obviously misdiagnosis can happen to anyone, it made me think about many of the stories I've read and seen about women's health conditions being misdiagnosed. Dr. Janet Finlayson told me that sadly, this isn't uncommon in general, but it tends to be far more common among women.
Unfortunately, there are a lot of diagnoses out there that are very misunderstood or not understood as well as they could be. One of the things that I have focused a lot on happens to be women with ADHD. And what we are finding now is that in the earlier stages of us recognizing ADHD as a condition, it was very much geared around boys and hyperactivity, and it looks sort of this way, and it doesn't look the same in girls. And so oftentimes girls are not diagnosed with ADHD who have it, or they are diagnosed with anxiety instead of ADHD. Or once a female patient comes in and has a diagnosis of anxiety, a lot of providers just stop looking for anything else. And then they just say, oh, that's all your anxiety. And so we are seeing increasing numbers of teenage, young adult, even older women coming in who have had ADHD their entire life. And it's been either misdiagnosed or it was missed altogether. And only now are we really starting to catch up and see their symptoms for what they are, which is a little bit different than in males, but still very, very problematic.
There's been a lot of discussion in 2024 about the growth of women's sports, with the success of Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever selecting her first overall in the WNBA draft. There's also been a lot of discussion about where improvement must be made. I want to discuss some of the financial, emotional, mental, and physical difficulties that female athletes have to work through with the help of Val and others. First, let's talk about mental health specifically. According to the NIH, anxiety disorders are more common in women than men on average. This is particularly true, however, in the field of athletics. Val, who was in the process of earning her master's in sports performance psychology at the time we spoke, said this was the case. But there's also certain physical matters that tie into the mental health conditions you don't see in male athletes. I remember as a kid reading a capsule in the newspaper about the WNBA, which read that the LA Sparks were in for a rough season as they dealt with Lisa Leslie being out for the year. She wasn't out for an injury, though. She was out for something I hadn't even thought about: pregnancy.
We have the time when we have children. We have to take a whole season off just to recover from childbirth. Guys don't have to deal with that, or the hormonal changes and your body changes, the changes that your body go through after you give birth to someone. I gave birth to my son in 2001 in March, and training camp was in May. And I really honestly should have been playing. I should have just been recovering and focusing on being a mom, but I wanted to get back and I played. My body wasn't ready. You know, when you give birth, you have that hormone called relaxin that is in your system, and it makes you more susceptible to injury. It's for childbirth to make your joints lax so you can push out, but it's not the best thing to have when you're playing basketball.
In addition to the physical toll, there's also the mental toll.
I remember having postpartum depression and just wanting to cry all the time, but I didn't have anyone to talk to because at that time there weren't a lot of women with children at my age. There were people who had kids when they were teenagers and they were in the league, but there wasn't many people that had babies and were coming back to training camp. So I felt very lonely during that period.
I have no children of my own, but anyone can tell you that having kids is expensive. For a lot of pro athletes, we don't think about the financials. We're used to seeing things like Patrick Mahomes signing a contract for $500 million. Even bottom of the roster guys are making six figures. For women, that's not the case. In 2023, the San Antonio Spurs drafted Victor Wembanyama first overall and signed him to a contract that paid him roughly $10 million in his first year. When Caitlin Clark was drafted by Indiana first overall a year later, she signed a 4-year deal that totaled $338,056, paying $76,535 her first year. The contract is also not guaranteed. This is for a player that's been viewed as transformative for the sport. It's not just the rookies either. In 2019, the highest paid WNBA player made $228,000 in a year. The same season, the NBA's highest paid player, Steph Curry, made $48.1 million. Now, I know there's already people screaming about revenue splits. I'll get into more detail about that in a minute. But first I want to clarify. Yes, the NBA brings in an astronomical amount of money compared to the WNBA. It can also be noted that Clark eventually signed a historic $28 million endorsement deal with Nike, while other endorsements will bring her even more money. But this isn't the reality for everyone else. As Val mentioned when talking about what happened to the ABL players who didn't get WNBA deals.
We actually had one player, speaking of mental health, was so devastated she committed suicide.
Just a few decades ago, many professional athletes had to work second jobs during the off-season. During World War II, several NFL players left to join the Army because the pay was better. Today, women can't just rely on their WNBA contracts. This was the point that came up quite often in 2022 when Phoenix Mercury star Brittany Griner was detained in Russia for 10 months over charges related to marijuana possession. The part that often went unnoticed was why Griner was in Russia in the first place. Despite being a 9-time WNBA All-Star, she needed the money. And her story, while probably the most extreme, is not altogether unheard of.
Playing overseas is taxing on one's mental health anyway. Just, you're going over there, you don't speak the language, you're in a different culture. And as a woman overseas is different than being a male overseas. They worship you as a male athlete, as opposed to a female athlete. It's just not the same vibe. This is different. I mean, just look at the United States. It's still women's sports and men's sports are treated differently. And just knowing that you're over there by yourself, and sometimes it's safety issues. I mean, one year Brittany Griner was playing in China and she was stabbed.
But the other option, as it stands right now, is that they try to live off the money they make in the WNBA. That just isn't an option for some people. And while there was a lot of uproar about Clark's rookie contract, those numbers are far better than what they used to be.
When I played, I think the most I made was $35,000 for the season. So in the off season, you got to do something else. And what I did was basketball camps. Honestly, it's difficult to have a real job and then say, hey, I'm going to leave for 3 months. So I didn't really do anything off season besides coaching basketball with camps and clinics and stuff. So that was how I would supplement my income. And then some players, like Dawn Staley, I believe she was the head coach of Temple while she was still playing in the WNBA.
On the day of the 2024 WNBA draft, Chicago Sky forward Brianna Turner took to Twitter to post,
"Yearly draft day reminder to max out your WNBA 401k if possible. The max contribution for 2024 is $23,000, and the league matches 25%, so you'll get an additional $5,750 if you max out." Page 93 of the CBA.
Turner added that a rookie salary in 2019 was $44,207. Again, though, this is all better than what retired players are dealing with.
We don't have health care. We don't have health insurance. NBA players do, but we don't have health insurance. Retired NBA players, they get health insurance. Retired WNBA players, we don't have health insurance. So something like that could be done better. I think marketing and using the older WNBA players that were there when the league first started, not the same ones, you always see the same superstars, but the other ones that were there as well, pushing their names and letting young girls know who they are as well. I mean, there's more to the WNBA than just Lisa Leslie and Cheryl Swoops. there's a lot of great players out there that paved the way for those players that I think need to be seen and heard.
If you're still screaming about the financials, you can stop now. Even Val and some of the WNBA's biggest supporters will tell you that the primary reason players aren't getting paid is because the money isn't there yet. While the league has existed for 27 years, in the world of sports, that's not that long. While the revenue brought in by the WNBA has seen significant increases the past few years, and the belief is that it will skyrocket by the time Clark's first season comes to a close, it is not a profitable league. In fact, according to NBA Commissioner Adam Silver, it's never turned a profit in its existence. Each year, the WNBA loses roughly $10 million. Val even acknowledges that the league cannot yet support itself, as the NBA has been subsidizing the organization for years. The salary cap for an entire team in the WNBA is roughly $1.46 million. This is also where I have to go back to what Val said about the ABL folding, because they were paying players six figures from the get-go. The WNBA brought in $60 million in 2019, while the NBA brought in $7 billion. For roughly every $100 the NBA generates from revenue, the WNBA generates 60 cents. So it makes sense that the women won't make the kind of money that the men do. However, there's more information that needs to be broken down there. Many longtime WNBA supporters, including Val, voiced their frustrations online that people were up in arms at how little Clark would be making, given the past discourse over payment in the WNBA. Former ESPN analyst Jameel Hill pointed out on Twitter that the NBA has had more than 50 years of investment, media coverage, and financing to get to the point where it is now. ESPN commentator Sarah Spain pointed out that early NBA games were doubleheaders with college games to draw fans in. The playoffs were tape delayed until 1986. In the early 80s, the average attendance for NBA games was usually less than 10,000 people. Hill also pointed out that Clark's contract pays her for 40 games over 4 months, half the regular season slate that NBA players get. Players also receive free housing and a complimentary vehicle. While that doesn't offset the other issues, namely that NBA players receive 53% of the basketball-related revenue split compared to about 20% for the WNBA, it helps explain the low salary numbers. But there's two other things that Val, Hill, and countless others have pointed out. The first, women's sports and basketball in particular are growing in popularity at an astronomical rate. In 2019, there was a 200% increase in WNBA regular season viewership. The regular season average viewership in 2022 was 412,000. And again, those numbers should go up by the end of Clark's debut season. She's had that kind of impact every step of her career. The Indiana Fever's Instagram following went from 132,000 to 248,000 in 3 days after the team drafted her. The Elite Eight games between Iowa and LSU, a rematch of the previous year's title game, was the most watched women's basketball game of any kind, a record that was broken days later when Iowa played UConn in the Final Four, and again, days after that, when Iowa played South Carolina for the championship game. From 12.3 million viewers for LSU Iowa to 14.2 million for Iowa UConn to 18.7 million for the championship. The championship viewership was up 285% from 2022. Outside of football, the World Cup, and the Olympics, no sporting event had generated more viewers since 2019 across any TV network than the championship game between Iowa and South Carolina. More than the NBA, MLB, NHL, or UFC. The two previous games were also more watched than that year's NBA Finals or World Series. It also drew more viewers than that year's men's championship between UConn and Purdue, the first time the women were more watched than the men in tourney history. Prices for women's Final Four tickets that year were also more than double that of the men's, with an average cost of $2,323. That last bit is perhaps more critical because companies are starting to see the monetary potential of women's sports. Fanatics CEO Michael Rubin said that Clark had the highest selling jersey on draft night of any athlete in any sport in the company's existence. But it's not just Clark. In 2024, non-Iowa women's games in the NCAA tournament saw viewership increase 74% thanks to stars like Camila Cardoso of South Carolina, Stanford's Cameron Brink, USC's Juju Watkins, and others. The previous record for WNBA draft viewership was 601,000 in 2004. In 2024, with Angel Reese and others joining Clark in the league, a new record of 2.46 million viewers tuned in. Flau'jae Johnson, Watkins, and others remain in college, and the game is continuing to grow. As for the WNBA, that brings us to the second thing to note about the salaries. They should be going up once the new CBA is crafted. But the final numbers will depend largely on how the fans support the league. The WNBA TV rights deal expires in 2025. With the viewership numbers expected to explode, that gives the players far more negotiating power for a greater revenue split and puts the league in a position to inch closer to making a profit. When I looked into single-game tickets for the Sky before the draft even happened, the cheapest ticket for the season opener against the Connecticut Sun was $22. The cheapest against the Las Vegas Aces, the defending WNBA champs, was $32. For a ticket to see them play Clark and the Fever, $122. The WNBA currently earns about $60 million annually from its TV and streaming deals. 2024 saw the Fever land 36 of their 40 games on national television, with Amazon Prime and other streamers joining in on the broadcasting deal. As the time comes to negotiate a new deal, the money will come. But as Val and so many others have said, it can only happen if that growth continues. If the following Clark and the others have earned transfers from college to the WNBA, that should happen. But it only happens if people support them. As one Twitter user said, if you don't like the money Clark is getting paid, don't complain on social media. Buy a ticket.
By supporting the league when it's on TV, watching it. If you have a local WNBA team in your city going to the games, that's the best way. Watching on TV, showing sponsors that there's a demand and people are interested in the product, which will bring more money to the league. And then years later, maybe we'll have health insurance for players or even a pension. We don't have a pension either. The guys have a pension. And I realize the league is just only 27 years old and financially is not yet supporting itself. But those are just some areas that I think will show more love for the players that don't play anymore and also have paved the way for the younger players that are coming through.
As for Val herself, she's working on a memoir and a mental health performance book for female athletes. She's finalizing that master's degree and trying to make money on the mental performance coaching. She's doing well most days, and she offered up a lot of things that the WNBA and other companies are doing well that we'll highlight in the final episode. But it also needs to be noted that even for all her great athletic accomplishments and the role she played in the early days of women's basketball, she's still searching for ways to keep the income flowing in.
I don't always feel so inspired, if that makes sense. So I still struggle with finding my voice and finding the correct message to give female athletes that are out there. But that's what I wanted to get out of it, was somehow to be able to do this full time and make money. And for a while I was getting brand deals and doing campaigns with different brands like Dick's Sporting Goods and Procter & Gamble. They have like Always and Olay Body Wash. So I was doing that for a while, but that's kind of dried up. So I've been just thinking about different ways to make income.
There's something else I think it's important to talk a bit more about. Toxic fandom. I know you're thinking, wasn't that what the previous episode was about? Yes, but I want to take a look at it from a woman's perspective. I thought about the experience I had in Iowa and wondered how different things might have been if I were a woman. I wanted to talk to someone who could give me a first-hand account of her experience.
Hi, my name is Maddy Hudak, and I am Tulane sideline reporter as well as the host of the Before the Whistle podcast.
Maddy has earned a name for herself as the football sideline reporter for Tulane University the past 2 years. I didn't know heading into our interview that in addition to getting the perspective of a woman in sports journalism, I'd also get the perspective of someone with a background in mental health.
I got my undergrad degree, a bachelor's of science in psychology. I was going to go on, eventually get a PhD, I think. And so I started working at the VA out of college in Philadelphia. I worked in the behavioral health unit and I was the research coordinator of 2 separate trials. And so I really got a sense of all the different facets of psychology. And I kind of came through that experience realizing that just the way my brain problem solves, and I'm much more of a solution kind of based person. That's not necessarily the goal of therapy. And so it didn't really have the right personality fit for me. And the 7 years in school just seemed not that great.
Having graduated Tulane and moved back to her home in the Bay Area, Maddy went into jury consulting. She earned her master's in legal studies during the pandemic when she decided to make a career change.
I got laid off in August of 2020. And rather than immediately jump into another career that wasn't giving me any value or made me feel like I was utilizing any of my skill sets, to be honest, I just decided to spend that time enjoying something in that very sad time for a lot of people, which was a good escapism in sports.
Maddy moved back to New Orleans and was introduced to Corey Glore, the voice of the Tulane Green Wave. She was offered the role of sideline reporter, and from there, she began to flourish.
The second I stepped on the field, it just really felt right. And it just felt very perfect that my first year covering them was the 2-10 year, because I felt like there was something worth fighting for in these guys, being able to see how they worked on a daily basis.
She spoke at length about how grateful she was to Tulane and the environment they've nurtured. She said her experience working with the football players, coaches, and just being in a male-dominated field has been mostly positive.
Being a woman in a men's world, it just has never, ever felt like that at all. The players have just been such high character, really great guys that respect me as a woman. They respect me as a person, as a sideline reporter, as a friend. You know, it's not just this very superficial or feeling like they have to tread around me because I'm a woman in the huddle kind of thing. So I've really assimilated there. And again, the support from Corey Glore, Steve Barrios, and just the amount of time they give me on the broadcast and the respect they really give to my role, I think it all really works well in tandem. And they've also had my back in situations where I have kind of gone out on a limb.
While her primary focus has been with Tulane, Maddy's also done work covering the New Orleans Saints and the NFL. She went back to an experience she had online in 2022. Specifically, she referenced online harassment stemming from her views on the case of Deshaun Watson. For those unfamiliar, Watson was the quarterback for the Houston Texans at the time. A 3-time Pro Bowler, Watson was accused of sexual misconduct by more than 24 female massage therapists in early 2021. Ultimately, a grand jury declined to press criminal charges in March of 2022, and Watson settled 22 civil lawsuits out of court. Though the NFL ultimately suspended him for 11 games in the 2022 season and ordered him to pay a record $5 million fine, that didn't stop 4 teams from pursuing him by trade. It also didn't stop the Cleveland Browns from trading Houston 3 first-round picks, a 3rd-round pick, and 2 4th-rounders in exchange for Watson. It also didn't stop Cleveland from signing Watson to a fully guaranteed 5-year, $230 million deal, the largest contract and most guaranteed money in NFL history at the time. New Orleans was allegedly one of the teams interested in trading for Watson. During the time, Maddy spoke out publicly on Twitter.
Having a master's in legal studies, I had taken a law school level criminal procedure course as part of my program. So I actually really understand statutes and how to read complaints, how to read Supreme Court opinions that I wouldn't have otherwise had without seeking that out. And so I read, all 23 of the complaints. I'm not someone that just has hot takes or doesn't read very immensely into things. I've read, hundreds of things that I don't even want to go into, just the rabbit holes I've delved into, but because they're good football players and people want them linked to your team, a lot of the time they can overlook those kinds of things. And it's a perspective that I can understand to a degree. I think, again, it's really hard for me to separate being a woman and seeing immediately just the power difference when it comes to being a woman in a room alone with a guy, just in a very primal, for lack of a better term, way that I think a lot of guys can. And I spoke out a lot about that, and it was very exhausting.
Saints fans and Watson defenders began attacking Maddy on Twitter. While I wasn't able to go back and find the tweets themselves, I've been a Tulane fan my whole life and have been following Maddy since very early on in her career. I remember people insinuating that she didn't know what she was talking about and dismissing her outright as a person who had no knowledge of how things worked, despite the fact that her legal background probably gave her a better understanding than them. The only thing she knew to do was to step away.
In order to protect yourself, you do have to pick and choose your battles as a woman in sports, because if you choose to stand up against it's just very exhausting. And I had to kind of learn that the hard way, really speaking my mind. And I know that's kind of a sad thing to say, but I do think people having just boundaries in this industry, whichever way that might mean to you, is really important. And I know that sometimes I can't separate myself from being an advocate, and it was an issue in my jobs when that was legitimately required in the title. I still always really just wanted to keep fighting for people. I had to learn how to mute, how to block people, how to turn off my Twitter DM requests. It was very exhausting, and I found myself just really getting lost in this fight. And I wasn't even sure about what at that point, but it was hard for me to ignore as well all of the messages I was getting throughout that time of thank you for just bringing this up and talking about it. And I knew that I had a little more leeway to do so, given that I was a little more independent and I had the support of what would consider be my employment at that time. But it is difficult, and you have to have your own personal support system, but you do have to have boundaries. And there was just a point where I had to kind of just shut it off and take a little bit of a step back and learn that that was a battle that I would pick and choose every time, but maybe not some of the smaller ones along the way, just because it does get exhausting.
Maddy says she got the G-rated experience compared to what some women have had to deal with. It made me think back to the book I mentioned in the last episode, So You've Been Publicly Shamed by Jon Ronson. In it, Ronson observes that while men and women are seemingly publicly shamed at relatively the same frequency, the content of what is said is always worse for women. He observed that most shaming for men is calls for their jobs or being told to kill themselves, while women are told the exact same thing, but also receive rape threats and are disparaged for their appearance.
If you just look on Twitter at some of the DMs that girls are posting that are just the most vulgar language possible, including explicit photos that no one asked for, maybe I get those that I just don't check, but that is something that I just continues to blow my mind when I see that.
You may be thinking, well, maybe some people just didn't agree with her. Or maybe if you put your opinion on Twitter, you have to expect people to offer theirs. I counter that there's an enormous difference between disagreeing with someone and degrading them. In March of 2024, when rumors surfaced of an upcoming Washington Post expose on LSU women's basketball coach Kim Mulkey went on the offensive in a press conference, threatening to sue the publication if they printed a false story. Ultimately, the story was released and was universally considered underwhelming. The response to her press conference, however, was anything but. Twitter seemed to come to the consensus that Mulkey must have done something for her to respond the way that she did. Sarah Spain responded to the video on Twitter saying,
"That's not how people who have nothing to hide talk."
You can think it was wrong of Spain to post an opinion when nothing had even been printed yet. I thought that she and everyone else who did so was wrong as well. But the response she got in turn was nothing short of appalling.
Hey Sarah, take your pompous, misguided attitude the fuck out of here. All you did was marry well because you won the looks lottery. No one cares what you think, just look pretty for us.
You're a Nazi who spreads misinformation.
You're a miserable bitch.
You know, an affirmative action hire like you means nothing to real successful people.
You're a journalist. You're the enemy of America.
Spain mentioned she was also referred to in one tweet as, quote, a cum-guzzling cunt, unquote. Again, I disagreed with Spain's tweet, but none of that is disagreeing with her. It's dehumanizing her. And it's something that happens far too often to too many women in sports. If you're thinking, well, you're a man and had to deal with disgusting comments too, yes, I did. But while I've had my physical appearance disparaged, I've never had anyone question my ability to do my job because of my looks. I've never had someone question if I got a position in sports by sleeping with someone. These are all things women in sports reporting have had to deal with. I once knew a woman on the TV side of media who told me about how often men would walk up to her and say she was their favorite sports anchor because she was the nicest to look at. When Maddy got into the business, she saw her own attractiveness as something she didn't want to use, in part because she knew that there'd be people like that.
I just wanted people to respect what I was doing and not have my looks come into the conversation. And so for the first year in this industry, my personal Instagram was still private. I didn't post any pictures of myself on Twitter, and I just wanted people to gain a respect for what I did on paper and not what I looked like necessarily. And working in radio, I mean, it certainly helps with that because it is ultimately just my voice. And so I do appreciate kind of not almost having to deal with that a lot of the time where, you know, I'm sure people say that, and under that video about the sideline reporting thing, I mean, there's always just the comments of, oh, you're so hot. And it's not, that doesn't really bother me, but it's just kind of, okay, you know, that's not really what I was trying to say here, but that part is unavoidable. But like I said, I have been very lucky, and maybe I'm just not within that many toxic fan bases or haven't caught strays in that aspect yet. But like I said, just the language that I see a lot of women posting, just the words that I cannot say right now that they are called, and just the things that they just continue to receive, and just that it feels very like targeted harassment towards some women. You know, I'll see some people on Twitter that just have the same person incessantly going after them, making new accounts, and I really want to know, why are you spending that much time on this? Are you a fan of sports? Because if you are, why aren't you spending your time paying attention to the team that this person's talking about? You might not like their opinion, but I think that's where, when you ask about the difference, when people don't like my opinion, it devolves a lot more into what I look like and that I have no place in this industry. Whereas when they don't like what a guy says, they certainly don't get called great names either, but you hear a lot less of them being a misfit for where they are. And so again, I just feel like it's always going to be the square peg in a circle hole thing.
Perhaps you're thinking of Livy Dunn right now, how she's used her status as a sex symbol to profit, as the Cavender twins and others have done. For one, those women made a choice to use their sex appeal. Two, well, I'll let Maddy handle this one. In the beginning, she references a 2023 article in the Free Press focused on the Cavender twins, entitled, "The NCAA Has a Hot Girl Problem." The Cavender twins both publicly stated that they felt misled by the reporter about what the article would focus on.
And again, we could say, oh, well, it's only because of what they look like. Well, we've really spent this entire podcast essentially talking about how women cannot escape these comments about their looks and that being important to what they do, even just covering the sport. And so the idea that they're taking advantage of something that we already have to deal with on a daily basis, I'm like, good for them, honestly. It just kind of speaks to the problem of what we're only seeing women for if we're only boiling it down to, oh, it's only because they are pretty. Where, yeah, I'm not gonna lie, obviously being good looking helps people get along, but it's also, to me, not the worst thing in the world if they're using that in order to sell their brand. I think that you see that in influencers and every other industry where, like you said, Olivia Dunn has her own category of, yeah, we can talk about her looks, but she's a great gymnast. But even if these women were just kind of using their looks in order to get deals, I mean, so if you kind of have the presence of mind, that's being a businesswoman to me, knowing to use something in order to get money out of it.
Back to the issue of harassment. In the last episode, I brought up that it's easy for people who don't have to deal with this sort of harassment to say, just ignore it, or don't let it get to you. Fox Sports commentator Nick Wright said in April of 2024 that it's impossible to ignore it once you've seen it.
Even with the block, someone can just make another account and do the same thing if they want to. Again, it's just being a public figure, I guess, for lack of a better term, you do have to kind of bear the brunt of that. And yeah, you can't unread something. So when people say just to ignore things, I mean, I do genuinely recommend setting up things like filters where all of my unknown requests, if I don't follow someone, they go into a box where if I'm not in a good place, I'm not even going to just open that and even bother to see what's really going on there. And I'll kind of save that. And again, it's usually a lot of the time not that bad, but you do just kind of brace yourself because, like you said, once you open something, I could get over it eventually, but you can't unread things that are said to you.
While she played long before the invention of social media, Val has also dealt with online harassment since becoming a mental health coach. What's notable is that it wasn't old men who weren't used to seeing women in sports that were going in on her. It was young men.
I experienced that just being a creator on TikTok during the pandemic. When I first started, I got a lot of trolls that they had a hate for WNBA players and women's sports and telling me to stay in the kitchen and go make them a sandwich and women's sports is trash. And I was really surprised that it was young kids, teenage boys that were saying these things. I just thought that they wouldn't think that way. I thought somebody my age would think that way, not someone who's in 2021, 2022, that's seen women's sports on TV and is used to women being athletic. I was just so shocked that they had that view.
And it's not just women making their opinions known or expressing themselves that's generating so much hate. When Taylor Swift began dating Kansas City Chiefs tight end Travis Kelce in 2023, the couple became the talk of all media, social and otherwise. You don't have to be a fan of Swift, Kelce, or celebrity romance talk in general. You can find all of that annoying, fair enough. But some of the online vitriol that Swift began to endure simply for going to Kansas City games was ridiculous. When the Chiefs lost 4 of 6 games late in the season, Twitter, and even some talking heads began to question whether it was Swift's fault for being a distraction. There were people who ridiculed her for participating in dances with the rest of the fans during games. Following the Chiefs' win over San Francisco in the Super Bowl, people screamed at how grateful they were to not have to hear about her and Kelce anymore after they had to, quote, deal with seeing her the whole Super Bowl, unquote. This was in spite of the fact that Swift was shown for just 55 seconds out of a 4-hour and 18-minute game. The New York Times estimated that her screen time per game that season made up just 0.46% of the broadcast. We'll get back to this at the end of this episode, but for now, I want to bring in Dr. Finlayson, who adds on to the points that Maddy and Val made.
There's a long list of things that female athletes and females just in general need to deal with on a daily basis that other people just don't, and it increases stress levels. Females are often being put in the position where they're having to fight for things and having to push and having to advocate, and it can be exhausting. And yet, in the absence of that, change doesn't happen. And so it's kind of just a vicious cycle. So I guess from an athletic perspective, even though we are just over 50 years since Title IX was enacted, numbers-wise, there's some equality, but everything you mentioned, money, facilities, pay, media attention, there's still so much inequity that we've got a long way to go. Not only that, but in terms of healthcare issues and women's health, historically, women's health issues have been underfunded, under-researched. The strategy and the approach in healthcare has mostly been, we're going to use males for all of our research, and then we're just going to adjust everything a little bit for females because they just don't weigh as much. It's tragic. Our bodies are different, we are different, but we haven't had the funding, the money hasn't been put to really research a lot of these issues.
Janell adds to this that in addition to women as a whole, there are also certain intersectionalities and double standards that come up, not only between men and women, but in other areas too.
There seems to be more pressure to be perfect that girls grow up with, and certainly female athletes. I think social media certainly feeds into that. I mean, when I was younger, it was magazines, but now it's all over. So I think there's still a lot of double standard happening in sport. I mean, we saw it with the LSU women's basketball team, that somehow women trash talking becomes, she's too aggressive, she's too masculine, all of this, but guys get to trash talk and people think it's funny.
During the 2019 Women's World Cup, U.S. women's star Alex Morgan celebrated a goal against England by pretending to sip from a cup of tea in the direction of the England fans. She faced wide criticism by those who deemed her celebration as classless and unsportsmanlike. Meanwhile, when Aaron Rodgers would celebrate a touchdown with his signature discount double-check move, there appeared to be silence. Bobby Knight, one of the winningest coaches in the history of men's basketball, was known for his on-court tantrums, including an infamous incident when he threw a chair onto the court. Yet he's widely celebrated. Kim Mulkey yells at the refs and is labeled as an angry old woman. Maddy herself brought up an example from 1999, when U.S. women's soccer star Brandi Chastain celebrated a goal by removing her shirt and celebrating in her sports bra. While the celebration happens in men's sports all the time, Chastain sparked controversy in the moment, with some calling it quote-unquote unladylike. Janell mentioned the LSU women's team. She was specifically talking about the 2023 Women's NCAA tournament. In Iowa's Elite Eight win over Louisville, Caitlin Clark celebrated late in the game by doing John Cena's famous "You Can't See Me" celebration in the direction of the Cardinals bench. The clip was shown widely and received little backlash in the moment. But in the closing moments of Iowa's championship game loss to LSU, Angel Reese responded by doing the exact same celebration in Clark's direction, and she was called classless, disrespectful, trashy, and a piece of shit. LSU won the game while Iowa lost. Otherwise, the only difference between Clark and Reese is that Clark is white and Reese is black.
The awareness is there. The key is, once we become aware of those double standards, how can we call it out and then shift our thinking and then change our behavior and change our policies and change the way that we interact so that it's no longer a double standard. And you're right in terms of just intersecting identities, being a female and then being a female of color, and then just all these ways in which, if you are part of many marginalized communities, again, it is compounded in terms of the amount of difficulty, the amount of stress, strain, advocating.
Maddy, who is white, also acknowledged that she feels she's benefited from being white in this industry. I'm white, and know that I've benefited because of it as well. It should be noted, though, that the matter of intersectionality can sometimes become complicated. For example, there were some who accused Maddy of being a racist for her stance on Deshaun Watson. What gets lost in that take is not only her perspective as a woman, but that of a woman with an extensive legal background and experience in sports journalism with a lengthy history of victim advocacy.
It was really just turning it into a race issue more than anything, which it's hard. I can see optics, and I'm not dumb, but it's very hard to explain. That has nothing to do with what's going on here. Then the retort is asking if I have spoken about every single sexual assault situation that's ever happened in the NFL, and I don't know why I should have to, especially when I just entered this industry. I'm specifically covering this one team. I'll tell you, I don't support any of the people that you just brought up, but why would I yell about them in that instance where it's also not a current immediate event that is happening right now? And that doesn't diminish anything that's happened in the past, but just I think the idea that women have to explain themselves for those kind of things.
Janell points out for non-white athletes, there's the added mental toll of not just being a different race, or in this case a woman, there's also how you carry yourself. While Colin Kaepernick and others have been outspoken on racial issues, many black athletes have opted not to speak out on such matters, and ended up facing pressure from others to do so. Orlando Magic forward Jonathan Isaac, who is black, was even criticized during the NBA bubble tournament in 2020 for opting to stand during the national anthem following the murder of George Floyd. It seems that whether you go the Kaepernick route, the Isaac route, or any route in between, there will always be heavy criticism on athletes of color, regardless of gender.
I want to just be sure that the racial inequities are talked about too, and how that affects athletes and puts an added stress as well. And then athletes feel pressure to use their platform to speak out against something, but not everybody wants to do that. And then if you do, what does that mean for the dynamic of the team? So I think there are a lot of complex issues that athletes are dealing with now.
We haven't even touched on the most glaring issue that women face at an astronomically higher rate than men in general, that gets glossed over in sports all the time: sexual assault. There are simply too many various sexual assault scandals in women's sports to get into every one of them, but we have to address the scandal mentioned in the beginning of this episode. The NWSL, the largest women's soccer league in the US, saw 5 of the 10 head coaches in the league either resign or be fired for sexual misconduct in 2021. A 14-month investigation led by former U.S. Attorney General Sally Yates concluded that prior to the investigation's start, there were no written rules to reprimand coaches and other high-ranking officials for gross misconduct. The first 9 years of its existence, the NWSL operated with no formal policy prohibiting sexual harassment. In addition to the resignations or firings of those 5 head coaches, with 4 said coaches being banned for life from the league, NWSL Commissioner Lisa Baird also resigned. The most notorious example of sexual assault in women's sports would likely be former U.S. gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar. In 2016, Nassar was charged with sexually assaulting at least 265 young women and girls under the guise of medical treatment. Nassar ultimately pled guilty and was sentenced to what amounted to life in prison without parole. But that was after Nassar operated without impunity for 18 years, with some of the girls being in their teens, not even understanding at the time what was happening to them was assault. Dr. Finlayson explains how this sort of thing can happen and its impact.
We also know that women in general are much more likely to be victims of violence, sexual violence, predatory behavior, childhood abuse, online victimization, intimate partner violence. And so, statistically speaking, the majority of female athletes that we work with have had some type of trauma experience. It is something that doesn't get talked about a lot. It's also something that either gets misdiagnosed, or the shame and embarrassment of talking about it, the difficulty with talking about it, means that a lot of female athletes are walking around kind of carrying it, holding on to it, and not able to really feel like they can get support around it. I think that we have been taught in society to have a certain picture of what sexual violence is, and then if it doesn't meet that picture, then we think then whatever happened to me isn't the same. And the fact is that you're right, a lot of times it isn't until somebody really points it out or says it, or you have this realization, it can hit a person a lot later on, and then where do they go for help?
Women's sports advocate Kelsey Trainer, who is married to an old friend of mine, often posts on Twitter that when you invest in women, good things happen, and that the ROI is apparent. With the numbers we're seeing for women's basketball, it's becoming more clear that that's true. That's not the only women's sport that's growing in popularity, though. Despite the 2021 scandal, the NWSL has continued to grow, adding 2 teams since then and looking to add more. In 2024, Kansas City's team opened CPKC Stadium, the first stadium in the world constructed primarily for women's sports purposes. That season, average attendance among home openers was up 18% across the league. The league also signed a $240 million TV deal with CBS, ESPN, Amazon, and Scripps in November of 2023, a deal worth 40 times more than the previous deal. It goes beyond the NWSL, too. The Arsenal women's team averaged a league attendance higher than 10 men's club in the Premier League for the 2022-23 season. The PWHL, a women's hockey league, reported an average attendance of 5,109 fans per game in the first half of its inaugural season, 200 more than the NHL's opening year. The first women's national championship in basketball that was televised in 1992 between UVA and Stanford, which Val played on, averaged 8.1 million viewers, so the interest has always been there. Now, companies are seeing the money is there too. While you may complain about Taylor Swift's mentions during football games, you know who's not complaining? The NFL. There was a 51% increase in the number of female bettors wagering on the Super Bowl at BetMGM in 2024. The number of viewers for the Super Bowl? 123.7 million, the most watched program in the history of U.S. television. 202.4 million people watched at least some portion, a 10% increase from the year before. While the Associated Press said part of that uptick is explained by a change in the way viewership was counted that year, it's undeniable that part of it was also because of the mammoth following that Swift has. Those views lead to money, as Maddy explains.
I've been such a huge fan of Taylor Swift and what she's done, and the fact that the Super Bowl was the most watched telecast since the moon landing. I mean, that has everything to do with what she's brought on. I mean, the 10 million increase, when you look at the increase, I know they can't break it down by gender, but 18 to 34, you don't really have an issue getting men in that age bracket to pay attention to sports, but that raising as well as the younger ages too, that's all these little girls that suddenly really want to pay attention to football. And honestly, if things do start to change, I will probably look back at Taylor Swift for being the reason why, because she's just that powerful of a woman that she made the entire NFL stop. And I'm in awe that 44 seconds of someone in a 4-hour broadcast can cause this much dissent among some people that really care about it. But those 40 seconds also got 10 million more viewers to pay attention to the Super Bowl than last year's. And hopefully football fans for life, which is, priceless for the NFL.
As I said in the beginning, part of the reason I focused on men until now is because of the societal expectation that men suppress their emotions and not talk about mental health. Guys on the bottom of a roster in men's sports also have to struggle financially. And like I said, I've been called all sorts of awful things in my time in media as well. And yes, sometimes there are unfair generalizations made about men too. During the 2024 Super Bowl, Kelce was seen at one point screaming at Chiefs head coach Andy Reid on the sideline. While Kelce later said he wished he hadn't yelled at Reid, Reid brushed it off after the game, and the interaction lasted mere seconds. There were many self-proclaimed Swift fans, predominantly women, saying Kelce's behavior was abusive, that he's likely committed domestic violence before, and that Swift needed to be kept away from him. Obviously, that's ridiculous. But it also doesn't erase the realities of what we've covered in this episode for almost an hour and a half. It doesn't change the fact that there are certain things that women have to deal with in athletics and in life that men don't. It doesn't hurt any to take a little time to think about things from that perspective. Unfortunately, there are people who will likely joke around about this kind of stuff and misunderstand or willfully dismiss these kinds of issues. The sad reality is that this will fall on a lot of deaf ears. The first 3 episodes will likely fall on deaf ears as well. There are many changes that won't happen, or won't happen soon enough to make a difference. There will be some people who will have to continue to struggle under the current conditions. There are those who will continue to not reach out and not get help. Those who will feel unsupported. The only thing they'll feel is pain and confusion. All of that will build up until they feel they're left with only one option. When the Lights Go Out was written, directed, produced, and edited by me, Harpasani. Babe Ruth was voiced by Preston Moore. Sarah Spain was voiced by Alex Sharp. Brianna Turner was voiced by Kat Forrester. The Angry Tweeters were voiced by Mario Jerez, Craig Sperry, Peter Sather, Alan Roberson, and Aiden Bro. The logo was designed by Kayla Goforth. The interviews were recorded using Zoom, while the episode was pieced together using Descript, published using Spotify for podcasters. Special thanks to Preston Moore, Jared Lyons, and Alex Sharp. Next up, Episode 5, And Nothing Else Matters.